Salem, Massachusetts. Rachel Foster was working late once again, drowning in work that was keeping her busy. Her life was full of ambition. A young interior designer, she wanted to become a specialist who could be trusted with even the most sophisticated spaces. There was no room for relaxation in her plans. All her thoughts were focused on making a name for herself and gaining a reputation that would allow her to work with the best. And then, as the day was winding down and she was finally heading home, something strange caught her eye. It seemed that the city of Salem was hiding much more than she had ever imagined. All those old streets with their dark and dirty asphalt, abandoned buildings that stood there with no hope of being restored. And here, in the heart of the city, on the side of the road, was something that shouldn't have been there. Rachel usually ignored the old, abandoned objects that sometimes came across on her way home, but this time her eyes were mesmerized. A mirror. It was standing right on the roadside, leaning against the wall of a long-abandoned house. How did this happen? After all, the winds and rains that had been blowing here for years should have destroyed any old things long ago. But this was different. It was an object that had its own story. A massive dark wood frame, with intricate carvings full of symbols Rachel couldn't understand. It was antique, clearly had a history. And while the weathered paint chips and cracks in the wood suggested that this piece of window dressing would not see the light of day for decades, its presence in this part of town was eerie. There was something sinister about it. Rachel walked closer, her heart beating faster. Of course, she could have just walked by, as she had done with all the other abandoned objects, but something compelled her to stay. She ran her hand over the frame, and a cold sensation penetrated her skin, leaving a chill throughout her body. And suddenly, she saw it. There was no face in the mirror's reflection. There was only a dark silhouette standing right behind her. It looked like a person, but its movements were not like a living being. It was a movement that was more like a shadow sliding across the walls of a house and freezing when you try to touch it. Rachel recoiled, her heart beating even faster. She turned, but saw nothing behind her. She was alone in the street, the dark night swallowing everything up. The reflection in the mirror was still there, as if it didn't want to let her go. Something ominous was following in her footsteps again, and although she tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination, she felt a chill on her skin, spreading throughout her body. A moment later, she heard the soft, barely audible whisper again. Still, something held her back, and she looked at the mirror again. The reflection became clearer. Something more emerged from the shadows, a distorted, pitiful face that seemed to have been cut out of a nightmare. Was it a look or just an impression? It didn't matter anymore. All of her ambitions and career goals disappeared the moment she realized that she couldn't just leave this mirror here. She had to take it with her. But every cell in her body was already screaming at her to run away without looking back. There was no time to hesitate. And although Rachel didn't believe in supernatural powers, it all started to look like a real nightmare. Shadows in the mirror, whispers in the dark. She couldn't understand what was happening, but now it was too late. The night was quiet, and the city seemed to have fallen silent. She looked at the mirror again. Its dark frame with its intricate pattern looked as if it belonged to another era. None of these questions mattered. She would take it, and now the mirror would become part of her home. She carefully put it in the trunk of her car and drove home quickly. The time dragged on in a fog, and although she tried to think about her daily problems, her thoughts kept returning to the mirror, which had become like a focal point of her attention. When Rachel returned home, her eyes immediately fell on the living room, where she was about to install her new find. Indeed, the mirror was a perfect match for her interior. Its dark frame harmonized with the cold tones of the walls and the soft shades of the sofa. Everything looked as if it was made especially for him. This feeling of perfect harmony excited her. She could not take her eyes off his reflection. However, when she walked a few steps away, she had that strange feeling again. It was as if the mirror had lingered a moment longer than it should have. She frowned and tried to find an explanation, but it wasn't easy. "It's just a play of light," she told herself and decided to ignore it. But the longer she stayed in the room, the more this strange feeling kept coming back. 4900. That night, Rachel could not sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the silence in the house and trying to drown out the noise of her thoughts. But her mind kept coming back to the mirror. It seemed to be more than just an object for decoration. It was like something alive, and her presence in this space was like a part of something big that was invisibly embracing her in its arms. She got up in the middle of the night, deciding to check the mirror again. As soon as Rachel approached it, she felt an unusual coldness penetrate her fingers as she touched its frame. She looked into the reflection again, and this time she felt her heart sink. Her face was a little different. It seemed like it wasn't really her, but someone else was looking at her from the other side. And although it was imperceptible at first glance, there were shadows in her reflection that seemed to become part of her personality, even her inner state. Despite the fact that the next day she tried to put these thoughts out of her mind, the mirror would not leave her alone. All day long, Rachel felt this constant attraction to it. Every time she walked by it, she would look at it involuntarily, as if she were waiting for something new, something that was about to happen, something terrible. It began to seem like the mirror had some strange power. It became the center of her home, like an obsessive object that was impossible to live with. Rachel noticed that sometimes when she looked into it, she could see more than just her reflection. The shadows in the room began to move, like late at night when everyone is falling asleep. And although she was sure that nothing was actually moving, her mind told her that it was much more than just her naive imagination. One day, when she returned home, Rachel found all her things in place, but her house was different. The feeling changed, the space seemed alien to her. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not only her reflection, but also another figure. It was blurry, but it looked very much like her. That night, while Rachel was sitting in her living room, she heard a whisper. It was not a voice that could be heard in normal circumstances, but it sounded as if the mirror had literally started talking to her. Rachel didn't know what exactly happened. Her life would never be the same again. The mirror had become a part of her home, a part of her life, and even though she tried to get rid of it, it seemed to bind her to it. She was no longer sure whether it reflected her or someone else. Every day her life began to turn into a nightmare. Although Rachel did not believe in the supernatural, everything that happened to her made her question her own sanity. She began to see unusual images in her reflection that didn't seem to be hers at all. And then she started having dreams in which the mirror was the main theme. They were realistic, frightening, as if this thing was more than just glass with a wooden frame. It was a thing that could breathe, live, and influence her. A few days later, while discussing her new find with a coworker, Rachel, a little distracted from her daily routine, remembered the antique mirror she had loved so much. Her companion, Megan, a woman in her 50s, a Salem native with a lot of local history in her memory, visibly tensed up. "Rachel, are you sure this is right for you?" Megan asked, sounding a little concerned. "Especially mirrors. Old things often carry, let's just say, more than they look like at first glance." Rachel was not in the mood for such talk. She just smiled softly in response. "Yes, I'm sure. This mirror is mine." But Megan's words touched her. Rachel had long since formed a habit of looking for answers to questions that haunted her. That evening, she began searching the internet for information about antique mirrors. After a few hours of unsuccessful searching, she came across an article about the Bennett family, who lived in Salem in the late 19th century. Their house burned down to the ground, but strangely enough, the huge mirror in the main hall remained intact. It quickly became the object of rumors and gossip. The locals believed that the mirror could remember those who looked at it. Rachel remembered her past, a life in constant search of something better, a small town where she never felt like she belonged, endless moves and running away from something uncertain. This mirror became a symbol of stability for her, as if it could finally give her life the center it so desperately needed. But a few days after the mirror appeared in her apartment, strange things began to happen. At first it was nothing, objects moved to different places than she left them. It seemed that the mirror had somehow influenced her apartment. Every time she looked in it, she felt like something was moving in the background, fast and barely noticeable, like a reflection in water. One night she was awakened by a soft creaking sound coming from the mirror. She lay in the dark, listening to every sound until she heard a whisper. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to go to the mirror. At first, nothing was visible, only her reflection. But then the faces in the mirror began to change. She thought she saw other people, strangers, looking at her from a different angle. A few days later, on her way home late at night, Rachel noticed something completely terrifying. As she passed the mirror, she saw her reflection. But it was standing still. Her hands went up to fix her hair, but her reflection remained static. Rachel froze, and then, unable to stand it, she stepped back. But it was at that moment that her reflection abruptly stepped forward. She was seized with panic. Her breathing became ragged, and her legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. She fell to her knees, trying to tear her gaze away from the mirror, but she couldn't. Images began to flash before her eyes, flames consuming an old house, the faces of a man and a woman screaming, and it all seemed strangely familiar. That night, Rachel finally realized that she had to get rid of the mirror. Her apartment no longer felt like home. She felt like a stranger in her own space. Every creak of the floor, every whisper or light sound coming from the walls made her shudder. The fear was building up, turning the night into an endless nightmare. Rachel decided to take action. Finding a large, dark cloth in her closet, she was about to cover the mirror, hoping to at least partially remove its ominous influence. As she got closer, her heart beat faster. An icy cold radiated from the frame of the mirror, so strong that her fingers went numb before she even touched the glass. Rachel froze. It was not her reflection in the mirror. Instead of her face, a shadow stared back at her, dark and shapeless, like a silhouette but devoid of human features. The figure was motionless, but a dull whisper was coming from inside the mirror, growing louder and louder. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Her hands let go of the cloth and she took a step back, but the shadow remained in place, as if it were watching her. Suddenly, the whispering turned into a loud scream that made Rachel's ears ring. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The sound didn't seem to be coming from outside, but from inside her head. A moment later, things got even worse. The shadow in the mirror suddenly began to move, breaking free of the glass surface. It collided with the frame, as if trying to break through, and it seemed as if the mirror was going to break into pieces. But it didn't. Instead, the dark mass burst out with force and hit Rachel, knocking her to the floor. She tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in her throat, as if the air itself had become thick and impenetrable. Darkness surrounded her on all sides, covering her like a blanket that absorbed every ray of light. In this darkness, there was nothing but a feeling of heaviness and invisible pressure that prevented her from moving. Rachel tried to struggle, but her movements were sluggish, as if her body would not obey. She felt a shadow penetrate her mind, as strange images filled her head, the faces of people she had never known, the flames engulfing the house, and the same mirror standing among the ashes, retaining its original shape. She was seized with panic. And then, gathering the last of her strength, she took a sharp breath and shouted, "Get out!" The darkness paused, as if to think, and then disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. Rachel lay on the floor, breathing heavily. The mirror was still in its place, but something had changed. The glass looked cracked, and she could no longer see her reflection in its depths, only emptiness. Rachel tried to get away, but invisible hands were gripping her so tightly that she couldn't even move. The darkness swallowed her body, as if turning it into a part of herself. Her reflection in the mirror began to change, her features became blurred, her eyes glowed with a cold blue light, and her skin became transparent, as if she were a shadow. Visions flashed in her head. She saw women, men, even children swallowed up by the mirror. They stood in the void, their mouths open in a mute scream, and their eyes radiating boundless terror. They looked directly at her, as if calling her to join them. "Get out!" Rachel gathered her last strength and screamed, but her voice was deafening, as if it had been stifled by the darkness itself. The shadow suddenly stopped. Her arms came loose, and the world around her began to return. She fell to the floor, gasping for breath, but the mirror no longer emitted light. The glass cracked, and she could see a black void in it, so deep that it seemed to be sucking in space. Rachel gathered her will and grabbed a hammer that was lying nearby. She knew this was her only chance. She swung it and hit the mirror with all her might. The glass shattered into thousands of pieces, and for a moment she thought that the darkness had completely disappeared. But it was just an illusion. The shards suddenly began to glow, and muffled voices came from each of them. The shadows she had seen earlier were now emerging from the wreckage, slowly filling the room. They did not move randomly, they surrounded her as if performing a ritual. Suddenly, one of the pieces of rubble rose into the air, and her face appeared in it. But it was not her. Her reflection smiled so coldly and evilly that Rachel's skin crawled. "Thank you, Rachel," her copy in the mirror said in a voice that was hers, but also someone else's. "I'm free now." The copy reached out from the mirror shard and, before Rachel could react, grabbed her wrist. Darkness enveloped her again, this time completely. She felt her body grow heavy and her mind being pulled into a bottomless void. When her colleagues became concerned about her long absence, they decided to open her apartment. Everything looked intact inside, but Rachel was not there. The mirror was lying on the floor, the pieces neatly stacked in the corner of the room. A month later, the apartment's new tenant, a student named Alex, found the mirror fragments stacked in the corner of the room. They looked like ordinary trash that had been forgotten to be taken out. He decided to remove them, but as soon as he touched the first piece, he felt a sharp cold piercing his fingers. When Alex picked up the shard, an image flashed on its surface. He held it closer to the light and saw himself. But the reflection didn't look quite right, his eyes seemed a little darker, his lips slightly puckered, and his face radiated something sinister. Alex felt something compelling him to look deeper. The reflection moved, although he stood motionless. Suddenly, his copy in the shard tilted its head and whispered, "Do you want to be a part of this too?" The boy threw the shard to the floor, but the voice did not stop. Whispering and laughter came from all the shards, filling the room. The light in the apartment began to flicker, and the walls seemed to move closer to him. Alex felt his feet were glued to the floor. He couldn't move, and the fragments of the mirror rose into the air, gathering into a bizarre structure right in front of him. The glass trembled as if it had a life of its own until the fragments formed a new, almost perfect frame. He was no longer the only one in the mirror. Around his reflection appeared the faces of people who looked like ghosts, each of them staring directly at him. They were whispering his name, calling out to him. One face stood out among the others, a woman with empty eyes like black holes. It was Rachel. He felt the mirror pull him forward. His body became light, as if losing touch with reality. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The mirror swallowed him up step by step until his face was one of those looking out from the dark surface. The next day, his neighbors noticed that the door to the apartment was open. Inside, everything was in perfect order, as if no one had ever lived there. The mirror stood in the center of the room, intact as before, but now a new face could be seen on its surface, frozen in a mute scream.